Hello, and we're in Deuteronomy. We're going to finish off chapter 17. So let's read it. We've done the first 7 verses in the previous video on Deuteronomy. So reading from verse 8 from the NIV. If cases come before your courts that are too difficult for you to judge, whether bloodshed, lawsuits or assaults, take them to the place the Lord your God will choose. Go to the Levitical priests and to the judge who is in office at the time. Inquire of them, and they will give you the verdict. You must act according to the decisions they give you at the place the Lord will choose. Be careful to do everything they instruct you to do. Act according to whatever they teach you and the decisions they give. Do not turn aside from what they tell you to the right or to the left. Anyone who shows contempt for the judge or for the priest who stands ministering there to the Lord your God is to be put to death. You must purge the evil from Israel. All people will hear and be afraid and will not be contemptuous again. When you enter the land the Lord your God is giving you, and have taken possession of it and settled in it, and you say, "Let us set a king over us, like all the nations around us," be sure to appoint over you a king the Lord your God chooses. He must be from among your fellow Israelites. Do not place a foreigner over you, one who is not an Israelite. The king, moreover, must not acquire great numbers of horses for himself, or make the people return to Egypt to get more of them. For the Lord has told you, you are not to go back that way again. He must not take many wives, so his heart will be led astray. He must not accumulate large amounts of silver and gold. When he takes the throne of his kingdom, he is to write for himself on a scroll a copy of this law, taken from that of the Levitical priests. It is to be with him, and he is to read it all the days of his life, so that he may learn to revere the Lord his God, and follow carefully all the words of this law and these decrees, and not consider himself better than his fellow Israelites, and turn from the law to the right or to the left. Then his descendants will reign a long time over his kingdom in Israel. So this is more preparation for entering the promised land and how to live in the land. And the first one deals with law courts, and it seems that they had a kind of a gradation of law courts like we do. So we have magistrates' courts and county courts and what have you, depending whether you're in England or Scotland. And the more difficult cases were to be taken effectively to the higher courts. And then you've got in these courts, it was the priests and the judge who were in charge of making the decisions. And their decisions were to be treated very seriously. There was to be a respect for law. If there is no respect for law, then society starts to break down very quickly. But it's equally important that those who are in power within the legal system, in our nations, the judges. It's interesting here, you've got judges and priests. In the case of Israel, what they were to do was to effectively enact the law of God. They certainly weren't there to do their own bidding. They were there to do God's bidding. And in these days we have some that are called activist judges. Particularly true in the United States. It's also becoming true in our own country, where the judges effectively interpret the law. They don't just enforce the law, they interpret it, and interpret it according to their own political or social leanings. And that's a very dangerous situation to be in. But here, the emphasis here is on the people having respect for the law. And for things to work, people need to have respect for the law, and judges need to have realise their place, not go beyond it. Then come to kings, and it says, when you say, "Let us have a king," Israel didn't have a king at this point. They didn't need one. They had God. They didn't need a king. God knew full well that they would demand a king at some point, and as they did, you read about it in 1 Samuel, Saul being the first king. And Israel's kings were all the disaster. Well, not all a complete disaster. Most of them were a disaster. But even the good ones had very serious failings. David committing adultery and murder, essentially. Other ones, many kings who started off well, ended up badly. God was their king. And the king who is set on the throne forever is Jesus. So God's will is done. But anyway, he allowed them to have a king. God sometimes allows us to do things, even though they're not good. And they will, in a sense, cause trouble for us. See, it's far better to stick with God's ways. But anyway, look at the restrictions though. The king was not to acquire great wealth or power for himself. Again, he wasn't there to do his will. He was there, or should have been there, to lead the people in God's ways. So he wasn't to have great wealth, certainly wasn't to take them back to Egypt, wasn't to have many wives. Now, many of the kings, including David, had multiple wives. The supreme example of that, of course, is Solomon, who had 700 wives, 300 concubines. He was a complete nutter. One of the things I find very difficult with the Bible, right, you've got the Proverbs, the book of wisdom, and most of it was written by Solomon. And you think, but this guy had 700 wives. How on earth can he possibly have any wisdom? He abandoned all wisdom by the time he started taking wives. But anyway, that's just one of the mysteries of life. So they weren't to accumulate great wealth. So then verse 18 and 19 was to have a copy of the law. He was to write it down himself. And he was to read it and obey it. The king was under God's authority. And we see that supremely in Jesus. Jesus said, I only do what I see the Father do. Jesus was in complete submission to the Father. And he was to follow God's ways. And also not consider himself better than his fellow Israelites. Now we see it, people get into exalted positions, whether it is as a king or president, or someone gets promoted at work and becomes a boss or whatever. So very often they get full of big ideas about themselves, and pride comes before the fall. But if they wanted to reign a long time, they needed to reign under God's authority, doing things in God's way. And for all of us, we might not be kings, at least in that sense, but we should live according to God's ways. We are here as Christ's servants. And if we do that, things will work out an awful lot better. Amen.